Okay, gigantic apologies for that, everybody. Very unprofessional. There was someone knocking at my door and I had to pause, and because, as you noticed, I do all these in one take. So because it's not because I'm trying to show off or do something different and cool. I would really like my videos to look professional and have music and have like jump cuts and things. I don't know how to edit yet, so it will be something that I'll do if it's worth doing. But at the moment I just have to do everything in one take, so that means occasionally if something goes wrong halfway through, I just have to pause and then start again. So this is going to be in 2 parts. It doesn't look great. What am I doing? Who knows? Anyway, moving on, we are going to talk about the next scene, which is Act 2, Scene 2. Now, Act 2, Scene 2 is an interesting one because, just to sort of recap a little bit, we've left Act 2, Scene 1 with Lady Macbeth and Macbeth back together. She's gone and planted the daggers back on the guards, and he is feeling very, very guilty. And we start to hear this banging, this knocking, all right, towards the end of the scene, and it's interspersed with their dialogue. And it's brilliant because at that moment, we don't know where that knocking's coming from. We don't know what it is. You know, if we think metaphorically, is it sort of, you know, like conscience knocking on the door for them? Or is it sort of, you know, like hell, the gates of whatever? But actually, it moves into the next scene. That knocking actually becomes part of the next scene. Sorry. And so what we realise is that it's someone knocking at the gates of the castle. And so at the end of Act 2, Scene 1, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth sort of go, right, we've got to go. We've got to get our night clothes on. We've got to look like we've been sleeping all night. Yeah, we need to look innocent. We need to look like we've just been sleeping all night. Nothing dodgy going on here. So they disappear to go and do that. Now, again, thinking about the form of the play, the fact that this is a play, this is done firstly to release tension for a minute, okay? Because our tension levels right now for an audience are up here. We're thinking, oh my goodness, you know, the king's dead and they're really nervous and we don't know if they're going to get caught, so on and so forth. But the other practical reason that we have this next scene as they run off is because they would be covered in blood and they need to like get cleaned up and change and stuff. So we have this next scene, which works, one, to give the actors a chance to get sorted. Two, probably more importantly, is to break that tension for a minute, okay? If you're watching a horror film that has loads and loads of jump scares, eventually you sort of become desensitized to those jump scares. Things are more effective if they're sort of, you know, it's quality, not quantity, isn't it? So maybe the way to look at it is the audience have had this gradual build up of tension all the way through the last few scenes. And this scene that we're about to look at now is that moment where we can kind of go for a minute before it all goes up again. And it's the porter scene. Now, this is a scene that for a while, I don't think many teachers, myself included actually, kind of put too much thought into, because the porter is such a minor character in this play. He's only in it this one time. It's kind of one little conversation and then he's gone. But then everyone had a moment of panic where there was one year where it was this extract, the porter scene, was the exam question. And a lot of students were panicking going, I don't even remember reading that scene. Now, is that not the best reminder of you cannot just randomly pick out a few extracts and feel like you know the play? This is why I'm doing these videos, because you just need to know the story, okay? And like I said, if you can talk about it with that confidence and jump around who's who and what's happening where, in the sort of way I'm doing, you can't really get a question that's going to shock you, okay? So the porter scene is actually something that we need to make sure that we're at least aware of. Essentially, there is sort of someone who guards the gate of the castle, okay? And he is called the porter. And Shakespeare uses characters like this in all of his plays to give some comedic relief, to give a little bit of comic relief, to help people breathe before the next tense thing happens. And so the porter comes in to open the gate because the knocking turns out to be someone at the door of the castle. And he's drunk, right? He's really, really drunk. And he essentially, I mean, again, we'll look at analysis another time, but the reason why, the things that he's talking about is essentially he is saying that, oh no, I may have not used the camera. Hang on. Let's just do that for now. Okay. Essentially what he's saying is the castle is now hell, and he is guarding actually not a castle but the gates of hell, and he creates all these sort of imaginary scenarios where he's welcoming people into hell. All right, again, we'll look in detail at another day. But the thing to remember about that is quite often Shakespeare creates these sort of foolish characters, these characters that are usually of a lower class to the other characters. But quite often they say truth without even knowing they're saying truth. They speak the most clearly. They're the most honest. And the porter, you could argue, is doing that because he is talking about the castle being hell. Well, if you think about what Lady Macbeth and Macbeth have just done, they've murdered the king. And by murdering the king, they are sending themselves to hell. And this is their domain. This is where they live. So could you argue that kind of figuratively, metaphorically, are they now in hell? Is this castle now hell? You know, and that's sort of quite an interesting way of looking at it. But equally, it's also for a bit of comedy. Now, the people who have arrived, the most important person who's arrived is Macduff. All right, Macduff turns up because he says that Duncan asked him to come and sort of wake him up early the next day. So Macduff's arrived, and his sole purpose of being there is to go and get the king. So already that sort of comedy relief that we had from the porter starts to seep away, because we know pretty soon all of this sort of comedy and this happiness is going to seep away because they are going to find the king pretty dead. Okay, he's been pretty much murdered, hasn't he? And so they sort of take the mickey out of the porter a little bit, being drunk, and the porter talks about how being drunk leads to lots of different things happening to your body. He talks about it creates urine, so it makes you need to wee a lot. And he also says it creates, essentially, he says it creates lechery, which means like lust. It makes you want to sort of, have sex, but equally it stops you being able to. So it's kind of Shakespeare bants, like a bit of humour that potentially audiences nowadays, if you're reading it as a student, if you're reading it as a 14, 15-year-old, the language doesn't lend itself to you finding it absolutely hilarious. English nerds like me might, but yeah, that's sort of the point of this scene. Okay, we're laughing, it's hilarious, and then Macbeth comes in. All right, and when Macbeth comes in, he's, again, dramatic irony, right? We know what he's just done, we know what he's been up to, and Macduff doesn't. I think it's Lennox that Macduff's arrived with. There's another sort of nobleman that he's with. I think it's Lennox or Ross. I should have checked, but they're sort of talking about the king and like the fact that Macduff needs to go and find the king. And Macbeth sort of quite haltingly, quite difficult to speak. He's being quite blunt in the way he's speaking. He's nervous, clearly. And you can see that in the way he's talking because he's not able to relax enough to have a normal conversation. And Macduff's like, well, where's the king? And he's like, okay, I'll sort of show you where he is. And Macbeth sort of guides him to where the king is, and Macduff disappears. And then he's left talking to either Ross or Lennox, I can't remember who it is. And they're having a conversation, and Ross or Lennox starts talking about how it was a funny night. Okay, he starts talking about how the weather was strange in the night. He heard screams of lamentation upon the air. All these weird sort of things that seem to be happening in the night, like to do with the wind, and the wind was unruly and things like that. And he gives quite a long speech about how weird the night was. And obviously, again, we're going to get onto the religious aspect of this in a minute and why that might be. But what I always find really funny is the fact that after this quite long speech about everything being weird that night, Macbeth just replies, "'Twas a rough night." Like deadpan. Now, I always think that's one of those moments that the interpretation can be very different, because it could have been, he could say that very seriously because he's just thinking, I've just got to agree with him. Yep, 'twas a rough night, wasn't it? Or is he could he say that almost in a slightly funny way, a slightly wry, sarcastic way? Because, yeah, you think you had a rough night, mate. Like, yeah, it was a rough night because I was up murdering all night. So there's that moment there where you see Macbeth obviously knowing a lot more than the person he's speaking to knows, and the audience know a lot more. And ironically, you're almost nervous for Macbeth. He's done this terrible thing, but you're not necessarily hating him at that moment because you have seen him be human as well. He has felt guilty about it, and we have seen him kind of be pushed into it. So it's a funny position for us all to be in with it. Anyway, so at that point, Macduff comes back, and he is obviously he's discovered the death, and he is shouting and screaming and talking about horror, horror, horror. You know, he is absolutely devastated that this has happened. And everybody in the castle gets woken up, and, you know, there's shock and horror and despair all over the place. And then Lady Macbeth comes into the scene, and she essentially sort of acts completely innocent, obviously. And she says, well, you know, what is all this noise that disturbs our slumber? You know, what is going on here? Completely innocent. Remember, look like the innocent flower, be the serpent under it. And she is really playing up to this because she acts completely innocent, completely confused about what's going on, and completely shocked when she hears that the king's been killed. So that's going on. At some point, she also faints. Now, again, you could argue that she's doing this to take attention away from, you know, potentially blame on Macbeth or whatever else. But also, could she have fainted because the reality of what has happened has hit her? But anyway, what I find brilliant about that is she was all about stripping herself of femininity, wasn't she? She was all about not having anything feminine. However, she's using the fact that she's a lady when it works for her, because Banquo or Macduff, might be Macduff, I can't remember, says sort of like, love, you know, good lady, this isn't for your ears, this isn't for you, this isn't for you to know, because she can't handle it. And obviously the huge irony of that is that she's the one that caused all this to happen. So again, something to think about with regards to Shakespeare using gender roles and her and getting her to use the gender roles, I think is really, really clever. So Macbeth goes off to see the dead body, all right? And when he comes back, he essentially says that he killed the guards. He says, you know, they were the ones that did it and I killed them. And everyone sort of goes, well, why did you do that? And obviously the reason we assume that he does that is because he doesn't want them talking. He doesn't want them professing, you know, trying to protest their innocence, because that could lead to more questions. He wants them to look guilty in the end, and that's the end of it. So he sort of launches into this very dramatic speech about, you know, how can anyone who loves somebody be calm and temperate when they're faced with such a horrendous sight? You know, there lay Duncan, his golden skin laced with silver blood, I think, you know, and there he was. How could anyone not do what I did? And again, it's all very over dramatic, almost like a persuasive speech you might write if you were doing an English language exam. But what I think is, again, a huge contrast to that is when Banquo finds out that that Duncan's dead. Macduff tells him, and Banquo just says to him, "Dear Duff, prithee tell me it's not true." And I think that very blunt, raw reaction of just like, please say that's not true, compared to this overblown, dramatic Macbeth response. Again, it's that foil character, it's that contrast, and it, again, to an audience that knows what's going on, the dramatic irony is huge because we can see what he's trying to do. So that's something else to remember. And at this point, essentially, we meet Donalbain and Malcolm again. So if you remember from a couple of videos ago, Donalbain and Malcolm are King Duncan's sons. Right, they're King Duncan's sons. Malcolm is named to be the next king, and Donalbain is just the other one. Now, Donalbain doesn't really have much of a role in this play after now, but they, while all this ruckus is going on and while all this heartache is going on, the shouting and the screaming, they sort of have a little aside to each other and start sort of saying, okay, this ain't looking good, is it? And they don't feel safe, understandably. They feel that they could be next. They feel like this is, you know, that there could be at risk here. And they, over the course of this scene, they decide that they need to split up because they're not safe together, and they need to go their separate ways to sort of stay alive. And so at that point, Malcolm is going to go to England and Donalbain is going to go to Ireland. Now, at this point, we don't hear from Donalbain again. We just assume he goes to Ireland and sort of just makes a new life there. I don't know. Malcolm, we stay with and we go and see in England later on. So we learn that Malcolm's going to run off to England to survive, to stay safe. But Macbeth later on does kind of use this to show that maybe they're guilty and it was actually them that did it. Anyway, so we see this ruckus continuing. The other thing that comes up in this scene especially, and I like to use it if you would going to do anything on deception in the play, because you can see Lady Macbeth's deception in one way, you see Macbeth's deception in another way, but you also see some comments on deception. Macbeth obviously is the most obvious version, and Lady Macbeth, but then you see people like Malcolm and Donalbain talking about the fact that there are daggers in men's smiles, okay, and to show sorrow is an office the false man does easy. That's what Malcolm says. And it's the same, isn't it? It's this idea of, like Duncan said earlier, there's no art to find the mind's construction in the face. If someone wants to lie to you, they're going to, and you're not going to know about it necessarily. If someone's a good liar, they're a good liar. And that means that you don't know. So what Malcolm and Donalbain discuss is, look, even if people are sort of going to be nice to us now and say, I'm sorry, your dad's dead, we'll protect you. Someone's killed him, so we don't know who it is. And if someone is a bad person, they're going to show sorrow easily. A false person can pretend to be sad very easily, right? And so they know that they really can't trust anybody at this point. And they decide that the best way to cope with that is to leave, to get away. So by the end of this scene, they've decided to split and go away to protect themselves. And sort of Banquo and Macduff and Macbeth have all decided to go, because it's morning, they're all in their PJs, they're going to go get themselves sorted and then sort of meet back again to decide what to do next. All right. Now, that's pretty much the end of that scene. The next scene is, where are we now? We're on the final scene of the act, actually. We're on scene 4. So in scene 4 of the play, we actually leave the castle and we go to, it just sort of says somewhere in Scotland. It doesn't really say where, it just says somewhere in Scotland. And we go to see an old man, okay? An old man and Ross. Now, the old man doesn't have a name. I believe, from what I understand, it's so that he could represent just sort of the everyman in Scotland. And they're talking about the night that's just gone. And the old man talks about how he, in all of his 70 years on earth, has never known a night like it, okay? They talk about how the wind was fierce. They talk about how they heard things. They talk about the earth was feverish and did shake. Animals are acting strangely. Duncan's horses went mad and started eating each other. We also hear that animals that should be predators are actually being made the prey. So like roles are being reversed in the sense that the falcon actually was killed by the mousing owl and things like that. Now, this scene is important if you're going to look at any element of superstition or religion or anything like that, because what this reminds us is the belief at the time in what they called the chain of being. Now, I talked to you about this a little bit in the very first video. So just to sort of recap, what was believed was that God, in Protestant belief, God had created everything, including the hierarchy that everybody should follow. So every man, woman, child, animal is on this chain of being somewhere. And it is not their right, and it is not up to them to decide where they go. They can't decide they want to move up that chain of being by being more important. That is where God elected them to be. God elected the king because the king is God's representative on earth. So therefore, if you question who the king is, if you harm the king, you are actually insulting God himself. And because the Elizabethans especially, they really believed in kind of order and things being in the right place. If you don't do what God wants you to do, you create chaos, okay? And if the chain of being is disrupted, chaos ensues. Look at what's happening to Scotland. The earth shaking. By the travelling lamp, it is day, but yet it's dark. So they talk about how sort of darkness is enshrouding, entombing the world. It's dark when it should be light. The earth shaking. Animals are going mad. Things are not right. And it's happened because someone's killed the king, right? The king's dead. God's gone nuts. God is not impressed. And he is punishing the land. He is punishing a land that allowed this to happen. And chaos has to ensue as a result. So this scene is essentially all about the idea of what happens if you upset that chain of being. Remember, Macbeth is essentially a cautionary tale, okay? It's a cautionary tale because King James, at the time of this play being written, he was newly appointed, and bit of a history lesson here, his mummy was Mary, Queen of Scots, okay? And she was actually a Catholic. Now, I won't go into loads of detail about context here, but what it meant was, even though he himself was a Protestant, it also meant that people had gone from having the Queen Elizabeth, who was widely sort of loved, accepted. There was an obvious lineage for her being on the throne because her dad was Henry VIII, so on and so forth. Suddenly, she's died. She was known as the Virgin Queen. She saw herself as married to her country. So she didn't have children. So therefore, there was no direct heir. When she died, they had to find sort of someone. And they were related, don't get me wrong. King James, I think, was like a cousin or a second cousin of Queen Elizabeth. But the point is, people weren't as kind of immediately sure of his right to the throne because it wasn't an obvious line. That, on top of the fact that his mum had been a Catholic, who Queen Elizabeth subsequently, no, not subsequently, but she had previously like imprisoned and executed. People were worried that King James was going to try and bring Catholicism back to England, all right? But he didn't, because he was a Protestant. And it was in his best interest to be Protestant, because whereas in a Catholic belief, the Pope is the head of the church, in a Protestant belief, the monarch is the head of the church. Obviously, King James, it works in his favour for the country to be Protestant, because then he's head of the church. So yeah, that's something to sort of bear in mind with regards to the country at the time of this play being performed. You're looking at things like, Guy Fawkes and the Gunpowder Plot. That was a terrorist attack on King James because Catholics wanted the country to be Catholic, and he wasn't. So there was a lot of unrest in the country with regards to King James feeling comfortable on the throne. And so Macbeth was essentially there to warn people, don't mess with the king, because, bad things happen if you do. Don't question it. Don't mess with that chain of being. And also, if you think about the sort of way that things go with regards to the punishment that Lady Macbeth has to have with her madness and her mind being so corrupted, and the fact that Macbeth eventually has to be, beheaded and conquered, bear those things in mind, and it becomes much clearer that this is clearly a cautionary tale. So if we go back to this final scene, hang on. If we go back to this final scene, those moments where they're discussing that things aren't looking good and, Scotland's looking very strange, they make more sense in the context of the play. So if you were to ever get a question about religion, or, sort of like, I don't know, if you wanted to talk about Shakespeare's intentions, what he wanted out of this, the cautionary tale stuff and the religious stuff, it works well with this scene. And the last thing to say about this scene, which I think is interesting, is Macduff comes along, and they talk about the fact that Macbeth is about to be crowned king. Now, I get asked all the time, sort of, well, why is it Macbeth? Like, why is Macbeth the instant thing? That's never really explained in the play. So don't worry too much about what we don't know. But it's decided that he is going to be king. Because there is a sort of link between, I think he's his cousin. He calls him cousin. I've never fully clarified for 100% sure if Macbeth is actually Duncan's cousin, or if that's just sort of a term of endearment for him. But either way, it's Macbeth that is now going to be crowned, and he's going to be crowned at Scone or Scone, depending on how you pronounce that word. And obviously, again, I've just finished talking about the importance of people respecting the king, right? And also the sort of damage a king can cause if he wants to you. But Macduff isn't going to the coronation, right? Now, Macduff is friends with Macbeth, and Macbeth is going to be the new king. But Macduff, he doesn't comment on why, right? He doesn't say why he's not going. It's kind of almost a bit evasive. They just sort of say to him, the old man and Ross sort of say, oh, so you're going to be going? And he says, no, I'm away. I will. He says, I will to Fife. So I'm going to go to Fife now, which is where he comes from. He is the Thane of Fife. Okay, remember the Thanes. And so it's an unspoken thing, but I always think that's a very subtle way of Shakespeare saying Macduff suspects him already. Yeah, Macduff is not liking this. He feels like there's a problem. He feels like clearly Macbeth's maybe up to something. Macbeth's done more in this murder of the king than he's letting on. And it's like Macduff is going, I don't want to be a part of this. And that goes on. Obviously, we know, I'm hoping you know, that Macduff ends up being the one that has to kill Macbeth in the end. So it sort of comes to its full fruition. So at that point, we finish Act 2, knowing that Macbeth is just about to be crowned, knowing that Duncan is now dead, knowing that his sons have had to flee, knowing that Scotland is already now in turmoil and chaos because of what has happened to the king. Okay, and we're going to leave it there because the makeup's done and because I finished Act 2. And I really apologise for how unprofessional this one was with pauses and starts and stops. I will get better. If I keep practising, I'm sure I'll succeed. So yeah, hope you enjoyed it, and thank you. See you soon.